Hello, everybody. Let's give folks a few minutes to jump on here. We'll start in just a minute, waiting for some more folks to join here. All right, we'll just give folks one more minute to hop on here, then we'll get started. All right, great. Well, I think we have a critical mass, so I'll kick us off. So welcome to Beyond CPE Hours. Gary Allison is going to walk us through the Prove It framework for learning impact. We'll go through a little bit of housekeeping before I hand it over to Gary. I'm Mike Red over here at LCvista. I'm the VP of Product Marketing, so really happy to host this webinar for everybody who's able to make it today and able to watch the recording as well. So we'll go through our goals for the session, which should look very familiar if we go to the next slide here. So Gary will walk us through why attendance, completion, and CPE hours tell only part of the story. He'll then explain the difference between activity metrics and learning evidence, and then introduce the Prove It framework. Four different pieces of that framework: learning, retention, application, and readiness, which of course Gary will go into much more detail. He'll provide some examples of how firms can measure learning impact at each level and discuss barriers that prevent organizations from proving learning impact. So questions we hear quite a bit from our customers every day. At the end of the session, Gary will answer your questions. For a bit of housekeeping, you'll see that there is a chat on the bottom, so feel free to say hello, maybe share where you are today in that chat, and you'll also see a separate Q&A so that you can submit questions so Gary can pick those up pretty quickly. We're joined by a few LCvista folks in the chat. If you see them replying, we have Fatima, Darcy, and Andrea in there to answer any questions or tactical questions that come up in there. In the Q&A, when you submit your questions there, you can also upvote a question you might see that you want to make sure that we get to. We'll try to get to as many questions as we can. So as we go down to the next slide, I'll give a little bit of context about Spiirall by LCvista. So that's the team that Gary works on. So what is Spiirall? Spiirall may be new to many of you. It's new to the LCvista family as of a little over a year ago. So for context, Spiirall is a managed service to help L&D teams just like you deliver superior talent outcomes. So Gary and other members of our Spiirall team are working hand in hand with L&D leaders every day to help them jumpstart their learning strategy, make sure they're focused on the right things, implement best practice development plans across different roles, different levels, and then pulling from our best practice content across numerous different providers so that our clients can get the very best material they can. And also delivering, in some cases, specialized programs, specifically in the areas of CAS and emerging leadership, really what we hear from customers like you are most important to them. And so with that, I'll hand over to Gary. Gary is our Director of Learning Applications on our Spiirall by LCvista team, and I'll let you take it from here, Gary.
All right. Thank you, Mike, for that introduction. Very much appreciated. And before we jump into the framework, I always think it's important to just provide a little information and context about my background. And so I did start in higher education, where I was for 10 years. The last five of those years were spent in learning and development in an organization on campus, University of New Mexico, called the Center for Teaching and Learning. And under that umbrella, there were two sides of the house. One side of the house is where we helped instructors and faculty members develop content, improve their measurements and their content delivery. And on the other side of the house, we were helping students become better learners, really focused on things like metacognitive learning strategies, collaborative learning techniques, and the establishment of learning communities via programs like supplemental instruction. And I actually founded the Learning Strategies program at that university, which was institutionalized and still remains to this day. Came to the accounting profession in 2017, overseeing training and development for an audit department, later overseeing learning and development for the firm. And then I left there to become one of the founding directors of Spiirall. And as mentioned by Mike, just over a year ago became Spiirall by LCvista. So when we talk about my role as Director of Learning Applications, we're really talking about all the things that have to do with making sure that learning is sticky and being applied. And so I'll go ahead and move into a familiar scenario, I'm sure, to many of you. And that is that, a challenge or a problem has been identified, a training gets scheduled, people attend, the course gets delivered, all those boxes are checked, and then someone inevitably asks the question, has anything changed? And so that's really where our conversation begins today. What evidence do we have that learning actually made a difference? So I always like to start conversations with a little bit of a pulse check. So we have our first poll, and the question is, which of the following can your organization measure today? And this is a select all that apply. So you might be selecting one, two, three, or all four items. But which of the following can your organization measure today? And so we'll give you uh, just a little bit of time to respond to that. Okay, I'm unable to see how the votes are coming in, but I do now see the results, so thank you. And what we're seeing is pretty much in line with my expectations. Most organizations can report attendance, many can report completions, most can report CPE hours, but learning impact is where things start to typically get a little bit fuzzy. Um, Gotta shout out LCvista on this because I do think that, especially because of the LCvista platform, our ability to track attendance, completions, and CPE hours has really been elevated. And not having to focus on that, I'm speaking from experience as someone who was overseeing L&D for a CPA firm, really allowed me to gain back some capacity so that I could focus on the metrics that really demonstrate that learning occurred, because LCvista does the heavy lifting when it comes to the compliance metrics. So, why do the traditional metrics fall short? Well, they are intended to measure compliance, right? And so compliance sets the baseline or the floor for what professionals in our space have to do. But it doesn't dictate that people learn. That's where we come in. And as learning and development professionals, knowing that the compliance is taken care of, which is always important, we can then start to focus on these other metrics. But attendance tells us they showed up. Completions tell us that they finished, and CPE hours tell us that they did whatever was required in order to earn credit. And even to take a step further, compliance, at least in compliance with the NASBA standards, require that we asked participants if the session or the program was actually worth their time, right? So we get some valuable data from these metrics, and yet these are not necessarily the metrics that leaders are mostly asking us about today. So, as mentioned, most of us are able to track attendance, completions, CPE hours, but more now than ever, leaders are asking, but did they learn it? Do they still know it? Did their behavior change? And can they do the work? And so the distance or the difference between what we're measuring and the questions we're being asked is what represents the gap. And that's where the Prove It framework really comes into play. So let me ask you another polling question. Which question is hardest for your organization to answer today? Did they learn it? Do they still know it? Did behavior change? Or can they do the work? Okay. And so we have a little bit more distribution. Did they learn it? Has 10%. Do they still know it? Has 14%. Did behavior change? Uh, Really important in this framework. And can they do the work? And so, again, that's what led me ultimately to develop this framework so that we could go beyond the requirements of compliance, which say make sure we know that they earned credit, that they attended, that they answered some kind of mechanism to show that they were there. And ultimately, we even asked them again if they felt it was worth their time. Did the instructor deliver effectively? Was the content meaningful? But the Prove It framework is going to take us a step further. And again, we're getting some capacity as we have a platform that is really helpful in taking into account those compliance metrics that tell us ultimately that training happened. But the first step in this framework is learning, right? And so I used to badger my teammates at Spiirall, and we would get some of those evaluations back, and they would say, "Oh, the instructor was a 4.8," and it would say, "Oh, the materials was a 4.7," and of course, we want to celebrate that because um, learners have to feel like it's valuable to meaningfully engage with what we're doing. But I used to always respond after the little celebration with, "But did they learn?" Did they learn it? We're looking for evidence that knowledge increased. Next step in the framework is retention. Do they still know it? We're looking for evidence that knowledge persists. The third step is application. Did behavior change? We're looking for evidence that learning is showing up in practice. And then the fourth step is readiness. Can they do the work? And we're looking for evidence that their performance is meeting expectations. So the last step is actually not officially part of the framework, but I'd be remiss if I didn't mention is business impact. But to be clear, in this L&D space, readiness is what we're measuring, but business impact is what readiness enables. So we're looking at a framework that's trying to move from activity metrics to evidence to impact. So the first step again in the framework is learning. Did they learn? Did they learn it? The proof we're looking for is that knowledge increased. And some of the ways that we obtain evidence that knowledge, in fact, did increase are things like assessments. Now, I have pre and post listed, and it's really optimal when you have a pre and a post assessment because knowing where your learners were, then you put on programming they engaged in, and then remeasuring after the program is really the best way to isolate the training variable, right? But I'm going to say this throughout the presentation, we can't do everything all the time, and everyone has to start somewhere. So sometimes you may want to start with the pre-assessment. You might just need to know, hey, where are learners as they come into this programming? Other times, what might be most important to you is in-state knowledge. And so you may not know where they started, but you just might need a measurement of where everyone is after they completed the program. But again, if you want to isolate the training, be able to attribute the knowledge increase specifically to your programming, then the pre and post assessment really allows you to do that. Um, we use Amplifier for our primary assessment platform. Um, it's a great tool because assessment is the core engine, whether you're in a course, but we also use a part of the platform called the Gap Finder or practice test quite a bit. And that's where we do assessments that even go across our curriculum. So, for example, we might do assessments on a complete set of audit, tax, or CAS competencies. Knowledge checks. This one is really important to me. Again, when I'm asking, did they learn? One of the things I've always really pushed is not using is the sky blue type polls, right? So from a compliance standpoint, that's fine. All you're asked to do, or historically we've been asked to do, is make sure there were 3 attendance monitoring mechanisms per CPE hour. But as a learning development professional, I want to know if people learn. And so typically we're going to present those after chunks of content. And it's a great way, since we have to launch them for attendance anyway, it's a great time to check in with the learners. Did um, what was presented in the last 10 or 15 minutes, did it stick, right? So whatever the objective of that chunk of content was, oftentimes I want the poll to really directly relate to a measurement that tells me whether or not that objective was achieved. And then, of course, you have things like scenario-based questions. This allows you to add additional layers of complexity or provide real-life scenarios that your people will encounter in the field. And then case study analysis is just a great way to introduce complexity, a lot of different factors, force people to make trade-offs and decisions as they're learning content. And so, as you see in the example here, a pre-test, post-test, where the pre-test percentage was 68%, post-test percentage was 86%. This is a key indicator that learning did in fact increase. So the key takeaway is that attendance doesn't guarantee learning. And so these are some additional steps that we take to gather evidence that learning in fact did occur. Retention, do they still know it? We want evidence. We're out to prove that knowledge persisted. And some of the ways that we do this are retention boosters. Um, these are intended to provide opportunities for what we call effortful recall, right? Essentially, you want your learners to take their mind back to the learning experience. I'm here to tell you, as you see at the bottom of the slide, the forgetting curve is real. And what learners currently know is more important always than what they once knew. But it very rarely do people become masters of content or of a new skill with one encounter. And this is one of the big challenges that we face is that we put on programs, but there's so many different fires we're trying to put out that we put on a program and then we move to the next thing. And so sometimes people say, oh, people are sallying it. They're just doing it the same as they did it last year. But if we only teach to the knowledge level, if we don't do things to intervene and ensure people retain, then ultimately we're teaching them the Sally because we're teaching them at the knowledge understanding level, but they may not be getting much further or they may have forgotten because there was distance between uh, the learning program and their opportunities to apply. Follow-up assessments, again, opportunities to check for in-state knowledge. you can also use these to help reinforce and give people additional opportunities to touch the content. Micro refreshers. Sometimes we create these if there's distance between a program and a refresher is needed. Little more intense sometimes than a retention booster. Usually our retention boosters are about 7 questions. They're usually about 3 to 4 multiple choice, 2 to 3 open-ended or application-based questions. These are a real staple in our emerging leaders series. We do retention boosters 2 weeks after you attend one of those programs. Micro refreshers, we do these. These are, if they're for credit, right, they're basically the same thing as what you might refer to as nano learning. So 10 to 15 minutes of content as opposed to a full 50 minutes to get an hour of CPE. So the example here is that after a training, knowledge was measured and it was at 86%. But 30 days later, with no reinforcement, it's about 62%. So that forgetting curve is real. And if there's space between what people learn and their opportunity to apply it, they're going to lose some of it. Our brains don't have unlimited storage. And one of the ways that we cue our brain that the information is important is by revisiting it. And so these are mechanisms to do that. Application. We're out to prove that learning is showing up in practice. And we have different types of evidence here. Manager observations, work product reviews. You just rolled out a new methodology and trained on it. But when you're reviewing work products, does it look like the training that just was delivered, or does it look like what people were doing before or what they were already comfortable with? Reviewing action plans, practical application activities. These are a real staple in our audit and our tax academies. All those modules essentially culminate with practical application activities. So instead of teaching content, talking about concepts, having discussions, they get to these practical application activities, and the instructors say, okay, get out those Excel spreadsheets, get out all that case study information in this time to do some calculations or determine the level of risk. And then peer feedback. So an example here is that if a manager can report increased use of the new documentation methodology, that would look like evidence that what was recently taught is being applied in practice. And the key takeaway here, again, space, time and space and distance from learning is always a challenge. And so some of these things provide mechanisms for ensuring that people don't forget, retention boosters, right? Or that people have a chance to apply and have a chance to practice in a controlled environment. And I always say, like, people shouldn't have to make their first mistakes on a client deliverable. We're here to give a safe environment where people can practice under controls. And so that by the time they hit the field, they're feeling comfortable, they're feeling confident, they've made mistakes, they've received feedback, and they understand how to apply what they've learned. So the next slide is readiness. Can they do the work? So whereas application asks, are they doing it? Readiness asks, are they doing it well? Right? So first we want to see that, did they learn? We want to see, do they still remember what they learned? We want to see, are they starting to implement the things they learned? And then we want to see, are they getting better at it? Right? And so we always say practice makes perfect. And so we've given them chances and opportunities to practice. We've given them opportunities to revisit the content. And now we're expecting that their performance is going to be improved. Hopefully, we're rolling out new methodologies, right, that are more efficient than the old ones, that are people could be more accurate than they were previously. And so great types of evidence for this are things like simulations, right? Trying to get as close to the real world work environment as possible, but still in a controlled environment. And so, for example, for simulations in our 1 year cohort-based program called Management Academy, they do business simulations via a product called Zodiac Pro. Again, performance assessments. So different than knowledge assessments, these are asking people to demonstrate performance rather than just demonstrate a knowledge increase and structured observations. So, can learners successfully complete a realistic client scenario independently? Another thing I wanted to mention here is that I know in this day, so many tools are available to us that weren't before. There's all kinds of different simulation platforms. But I'll just use this example. If you were at the LCvista Summit this year, I was running a session called Solving the L&D Puzzle. And essentially, it was a simulation without technology, right? So what I did was present all the attendees with about 6 scenarios. They had a list of risks. They had a list of strategies to address those risks. Ultimately, I asked them to make trade-offs and decisions. There was a bunch of risks, but they could only pick one to address. There was a bunch of strategies to address those risks, but I limited them to picking 2 strategies, right? And so part of what we do is we have to make trade-offs. We can't do everything for every program. So the mixing and matching and deciding, when do I need a pre-assessment? When do I need a post-assessment? When do I need a retention booster? When do I need a micro refresher? When do I need, right? So this is the complexity of a simple framework, right? The framework is simple. It's 4 steps. There's a bunch of tools and techniques, but we always have limitations. We always have to make trade-offs. And so that's really where the magic starts to happen. What tools do I have? What resources do I have? What risks are primarily need to be addressed? And what strategies do the best job of providing evidence that it was impactful? So this is essentially the thesis of this presentation. Different evidence answers different questions. So when you ask the question, did they learn? We're out to prove that knowledge increased. And again, one of our primary mechanisms are assessments. Do they still know it? We're out to prove that knowledge persisted. And again, we use retention boosters as one of our primary mechanisms, along with some of the other items that I covered earlier. Did behavior change? What we're trying to prove is that learning is showing up in practice. People are implementing the new methodologies, the new techniques, the new approaches, and we can see it showing up in their work product. They're following the new methodology. When I review their work papers, I can see the difference since the last intervention that we had. Can they do the work? Again, this is asking, is their performance meeting expectations? Is it improving? Are they more accurate? Are they more efficient? And again, simulations and different types of structured observation where they're actually doing the work is some of the best evidence that we can provide that they are now meeting the expectations of what they learn for what they learned. So I have one last poll for you all today. How confident are you that your organization could begin implementing this framework today? And again, I remind you, it's a simple framework. It has 4 steps. But the magic is using your professional judgment. What's most important? What mechanism provides the evidence that's best suited for the challenge or for the information that we need to know? So I have 16% saying they're very confident, love it. 61% saying they're somewhat confident, 16% saying not very confident, and 6% saying not sure where to start. And so, very helpful information. And if you're in the first two categories where you're feeling really confident or somewhat confident, that's a great place to be. And if you're feeling not as confident or not quite sure where to start, here's what I typically suggest. Pick one question that you can't currently answer. So just think about one of your programs. Did they learn it? Did they actually learn it? Try to implement a post-assessment. Um, are they retaining it? Try to ensure that when you develop this program, you have a plan for uh, another touch point with the content, meaning give it 2 weeks and send out a little short retention booster, a set of questions, quizzes, um, open-ended questions that require some cognitive processing. And is it showing up in their work? Create one observation or check-in. And so, again, we all start at different places, but ultimately our goals are the same. We're seeing a profession that's changing rapidly, and the need for learning metrics is only increasing. So, just want to encourage you if you don't know where to start, here are some practical tips. And I hope that this presentation was helpful and that it is easy for you to implement. And certainly, we would invite you to reach out to us if there's anything we could do to help you along that journey. So I think I'm right about at the time that I was supposed to present, and I think it may be time for us to see what questions there might be.
Great. Well, awesome. Thank you so much, Gary. We have one question, first question here to share that was submitted in the chat. So the question is for the application behavioral stage, how are you conducting the manager observations? Are you relying on them to share, or are you relying on the managers to share insights, or do you follow up with them?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is really the crux. It's a great question. I think it depends. I know everyone loves that answer, but it really does. So I think the, at Spiral by LCvista, we work with our clients in many different ways. We have different tiers of services. But most of our clients get a certain number of what we would call consulting projects. And so sometimes these are centered around design, sometimes they're centered around gaining evidence for impact. And so it ultimately depends on what project we're working on at the time. Sometimes we're going to handle level one and two. Um, Sorry, I shouldn't say level one and two. We're going to handle, say, the knowledge and the retention, but sometimes it's really more of a collaboration between us and our client, as obviously they have more insight into how people are performing the work and how those things are showing up. Other times we might send files, right? We might send files with certain kinds of work and ask people to send it back. But yeah, a lot of times the manager observations specifically are going to be in partnership with who we're working with on a consulting project for the particular organization.
Great.
So
Thanks for that,
sometimes
Gary.
I'm sorry, let me just finish by saying like sometimes we might create some kind of a log where we're asking managers to do check-ins at certain intervals and they're recording those observations.
Great. All right. So next question in the queue is, are you able to connect or share the data you collect against HR performance data?
Against HR performance data. I'm not sure I quite understand the question, but I think here, let me take a stab at it. My guess is they might be saying, someone had their mid-year or end-of-year evaluation and their manager says they're performing exceptionally, but we might have evidence that their learning doesn't match, right? So this is what I typically say. If it looks like in the learning environment, they're performing at a high level, but then they're not applying it on the job, I use that kind of a mismatch of information to sort of start down a path of identifying what's the real problem. Because based on how you perform in the training environment, it looks like you know the information. But if you're not applying it, what's the challenge? Have you not had enough practice opportunities? Have you have you is there a lack of motivation issue, right? So sometimes when learning and application don't line up, it kind of is a diagnostic for where the problem is. But if I see someone struggling in the field, but I see them struggling on a knowledge assessment, they don't know the information, it's not really reasonable for me to expect that they can apply it. Um, so I think it's just another piece of the puzzle when it comes to performance. But when you see mismatches, I do think it's an indicator that there's an issue and it requires additional follow-up. I hope that
Gotcha.
was what the question was getting at.
Yeah, and if there's more follow up on that question for whoever submitted it, please feel free to expound on it in the Q&A there. Great. So next question is, how can we create retention boosters, touch points in LCvista? What functionality does LCvista provide to help support this?
Yeah, that's a great question. Honestly, we have two two primary mechanisms in-house that we use for retention boosters. And just so you all know, I am the person that tries to break everything and use things even beyond their intended purpose. But primarily the two things that I use for retention boosters are Conferences.io. And so that might sound funny because Conferences.io is really developed to be a synchronous sort of audience response systems. But what we do is after our leadership series courses or our emerging leaders courses, we put together a slate of questions, few multiple choice, few open-ended. We keep all those polls open. We send an email with a barcode. We explain to our learners what the retention booster is, and all they really do is about a couple weeks after the program, they scan the barcode, they log in, they answer the 7 questions, and then once we close the retention booster, we send them another email with the results and explaining or expounding on any misconceptions that we found from their participation in the retention booster. The other thing that we use for retention boosters is LCvista activities. So, LCvista activities, there are opportunities to do open-ended questions in there. There's opportunities to do multiple choice questions in there. I know there are some enhancements planned down the road with regard to reporting into how to mix and match multiple choice, but we do use those as well. So those are the two things we primarily use for retention boosters.
Gotcha. Great. I learned something there. I didn't know that. That's pretty clever usage. Very cool. All right. So next question is, how would you approach a training if team members are showing that they have not retained information and or can't apply the knowledge? Is that a team member focus or training revamp with a bit of context for this particular situation that they have lots of managers and leaders that believe training is the quote unquote only answer to making the team member perform as expected?
I didn't make sure I got that one.
Yeah.
You want to try to rephrase that one for me, or repeat it? I'm sorry.
Yeah. So I'll say it a different way. Um, how would you handle the situation if team members aren't retaining the information or can't apply the knowledge? And I think the heart of the question is getting at, is it an issue with the person or is it an issue with the training? And a bit of context here is that it seems like some leaders in this situation think that it's the training is the only answer to the solve. Maybe that there's
Mm,
less of a person issue there. And again, for the question asker, feel free to add more context to that if I'm butchering it on you. Sorry about that.
yeah. Again, I think what we try to figure out is like one, I do think you sometimes have to stop and say, was this learning program developed in a way that's going to be effective, right? Was it sound from an instructional design standpoint? Was it sound from the way it was delivered? And if you find that that's the case, then typically what we're going to see is that the majority of your learners are going to grow. So then if you have a few who aren't growing, right, they might need additional learning opportunities everyone's going to ultimately need some retention boosting mechanism, right? Whether it's the type that I'm suggesting or whether it's additional trainings and touch points. Sometimes what I want to do is develop three trainings, and at the beginning of the second one, we start with a recap of the first one. And when we begin the third one, we start with a recap of the first and second one so that each time they're interacting, even as they're building new content knowledge, there's a revisit to bring forward the knowledge they already learned. And so I think trying to decipher if the issue is instruction or if it's a learner often comes down to, do most learners progress? And if so, it may be specific to that learner. They might need to learn it a different way, right? So not because people can't all learn in all different ways, but some people have preferences for how they learn. And if you can cater to someone's preferences for how they learn, you often get more buy-in from the learner, more engagement, and that often leads to more positive results.
Great. Thanks for fielding on that. There's a lot to that one. So just looking at the Q&A here. Let's see. Any other questions here? Um, all right, got one more here, and please do keep submitting them. We have a few more minutes. All right, here's the question. We have people who have busy schedules, and we rely on instructors and subject matter experts for their knowledge to ensure trainings are accurate and relevant. How can we alleviate the burden on our subject matter experts with LCvista from reviewing learning content to help create quizzes, etc.? So I think there is maybe two parts to this question. So are there alternatives to having the internal subject matter experts delivering training, right? Because certainly it's
Mhm.
time-consuming effort for them to do that. And then the second piece of that, um, confirming understanding of that training through quizzes and other means.
Okay, so let me just be funny for a minute. Um, I was asked to present this framework, but they're forcing my hand into a shameless plug for Spiral by LCvista. This is essentially what we do, right? To help our clients be able to increase their capacity. Essentially, Spiral by LCvista is going to act as a force multiplier for a firm that has limited capacity, limited resources, limited expertise, and sometimes limited want to. Some firms aren't interested right now in building out a full L&D structure. And so Spiral by LC Vista works with firms in those situations to essentially become their learning and development department. And while we're managed services, like the way that we work with our clients is really collaborative. And so ultimately, that's why a lot of firms turn to us because they say, well, we could hire four L&D people, but we still might not have the level of expertise or resources to do all the things we want to do. So those are present opportunities for firms to work with us as a managed service provider.
Gotcha. That makes a lot of sense. Anything else on any other tips, recommendations on um, reviewing learning content, confirming that things have been learned with an example of like helping to create quizzes internally, or maybe that kind of covers it. That's part of
Yeah.
what the Spiral team does. But any other tips you'd share there?
Yeah, I'll give a tip. I know everybody is more and more trying to use AI to support content development. I'll warn you, uh, AI can elevate bad design really quickly. So I'll be wary of this. But one of the things that I do is I create custom GPTs with a methodology, meaning that I use AI to help review content in the way I would review it, but it can help me do it faster. So I might tell it, hey, when I'm looking at this content for review, I want to make sure it has an engaging opener. I want to make sure that the knowledge checks all tie back to the primary objectives. I want to make sure that my questions are all of uh, approximately have answers of approximately equal length, right? Things that tip off learners. Hey, the longest answer a lot of times is the right answer. So I want to have my AI that I've put a custom GPT or methodology in, checking for the things that I check for as a human. And then it can still help me do it faster, but it's doing it again in strict accordance with my methodology.
Great. That makes a lot of sense, Gary. So we have time for one last question here because we're just getting up on time. So thanks again for everybody who's submitting questions. And so the question, this one actually came in through the chat. How would you approach working with L&D professionals in a firm on these types of initiatives?
Yeah, I think we do train the trainers programs, right? Oftentimes, and again, this goes back to my work at the university. The PhD in higher education symbolizes that someone has the content depth to teach, right? So a lot of professors don't have a lot of formal instruction in their background. And I look at SMEs the same. They know the content like the back of their hand. But some of us have had brilliant professors, smartest person you ever met, and they're talking to you, and you're like, oh my God, this person is brilliant. But it's a different skill to be able to distill it down to learners. And so one of the ways that we help firms with that is by running train the trainer programs and really teaching them methodologies and some methods that have been really successful.
That's great. That's a great example there, Gary. Great. Well, we are just 1 minute over, so we have just one last closing out slide here. So if we progress to that. Well, thank you everybody for being able to join. So some potential next steps coming out of this. So, thing one, stay tuned for our next webinar, which is July 30th. This will be in collaboration with Boomer. So Daniel McCormick, the president and founder of Spiirall, is presenting on the real risk isn't AI or offshore talent, it's standing still. So this is really getting at how the profession is changing profoundly quickly across all levels, which is impacting onboarding, progression within the firm. And so Danielle is going to tackle those topics. If you have any questions about what we talked about today in terms of product capabilities or in terms of potentially how Spiirall might be helpful for your firm, certainly reach out to your account manager to learn more. They can be helpful there. And for the folks in the audience that are new to LCvista and have questions about what we do, how we can be helpful for you overall, feel free to reach out to Amanda Hollingsworth. You have her email address right there for any questions and see how we can be helpful. So again, a big thank you to all of you. Thank you to Gary for a really enlightening presentation. And thank you for everybody for attending and for your questions today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Great. Oh, and I see a chat. Fatima wanted me to remind everybody that the recording and the slides will be shared soon. So stay tuned for those. So great. Awesome. Thanks, everybody.